Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of April of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Kiev, about the capital of Ukraine, because the most important updates is coming exactly from this city. According to information we have, there will be no elections. Zelensky submitted draft laws to the Rada on extending martial law and mobilization. Mobilization and martial law are extended for 90 days from May 9th till August 6th. This is a very important piece of news because I'll remind you that according to Trump, according to the 47th president of Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine would be settled in the very near future. But currently we see that Zelensky and Donald Trump has completely different understanding of the term of near future. According to Trump, this should happen in the next, let's say, 20-30 days, but according to Zelensky, it will happen not earlier than on the August of 6th of 2025. And obviously lots of things may happen during this period of time, and probably this situation and this laws that were submitted by Zelensky today were the main reason why Trump was very angry about Zelensky. The war between Russia and Ukraine is Biden's war, not mine. I just got here, and in my 4 years as president we had no problems preventing it from starting. President Putin, like everyone else, respected your president. I had nothing to do with this war, but I am working hard to stop the death and destruction. That was stated by Donald Trump today. Also, he added that it was very bad idea from Zelensky to start this war. When you start the war, you have to know you can win it. You don't start the war with someone who is 20 times bigger than you and then hope people give you some missiles. Maybe these two states, these two things, these two updates are completely connected to each other. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. Once again, Zelensky has submitted draft laws on extending of martial law, but as for now, these two laws haven't been adopted by the Ukraine parliament. But according to information we have, the Ukrainians will review these laws during the next several days, maybe during the period of time between the 16th and the 18th of April. And I'll remind you that according to the Russian schedule, according to the Russian understanding of ceasefire on the energy facilities, during the next 3 days, 2 days between the 16th and the 18th of April, the Russians will finish the ceasefire on the energy facilities for the Russians will be finished. And after this period of time, the Russians will have the right, when, if we can call this situation like this, to attack the Ukraine energy facilities without any consequences from the United States of America. The Russians haven't attacked even a single energy facility object during the previous 30 days. Yes, the Russians attack Ukraine heavily, massively. The Russians attacked the city of Sumy, the city of Kryvyi Rog, the city of Kiev, of Dnipro, trying to attack mainly military facilities. We know that there were casualties, obviously, but the Ukrainians attacked the Russian energy facilities almost every single day, and we have reported about this from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. But we believe that the Russians will not attack after the 18th of April the Ukraine energy facilities. They will wait until the 5th of May. You know that currently this is the situation when who will ruin ceasefire will be blamed, something like this, because anyway, Zelensky and Ukraine will be forced to adopt this martial law extension and the mobilization process until May 5th, because if they don't do this by this date, then Ukrainians will not be able to adopt this law, let's say, until the end of the previous martial law and the previous mobilization process, which means that Zelensky will no longer be a president of Ukraine. He will be forced to, let's say, give up his position, which is very important. So that is why Ukrainians will be forced to adopt this law, because Zelensky will try to hold his power for as long as possible without any interruptions. So anyway, Zelensky will be forced to adopt these laws, and then the Russians will be in full power and in full right to resume their bombs and attacks on the energy facilities of Ukraine. So at least we see the situation exactly like this. Now let's move to the line of combat contact. We have a lot of very important updates, and first let's start with the Sumy direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, the Russians began advancing in the direction of Yunakivka along 3 villages. The sources reported that currently the Russians are attacking the settlement of Volodymyrovka, the Russians are attacking the settlement of Vodolahi, and currently the Russians are trying to take under control the settlement of Belovody. So we see that the Russians are trying to get as close as possible to the western and the southwestern parts of the settlement of Yunakivka, which is currently probably the most important logistic hub for the armed forces of Ukraine. This information today was provided as by pro-Russian resources without, let's say, nobody still has confirmed this information. We're talking about pro-Ukrainian sources or something like geolocations, but this is the first sign, this is the first bell. Most likely tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, other mappers will update their maps as well. As for this direction, we have just one video. This one, let's take a look at this video, and here we can see how the Russians attacked the temporary deployment point of the armored force of Ukraine on the territory of the settlement of Belovody with the use of drone. So most likely the Russians managed to discover the temporary deployment point of the armored force of Ukraine or FPV drone operators, and the Russians attacked this building. A bit further in the southern direction, the Russians attacked the big forest, most likely the area where the Ukrainians concentrate their units, forces and reinforcements, trying to stay invisible for the Russians, being covered by trees and leaves or something like this. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Garnal. If you remember, during the previous days we were talking a lot about the situation in this region. We discussed that the Russians managed to get as close as possible to this church. There is a church, I'll remind you, and according to information we have, after 300 soldiers of the armored forces of Ukraine digged in deeper on the territory of this complex, and the Ukrainians decided not to surrender. I'll remind you that several days ago there were something like talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians almost accepted the Russian terms and almost agreed to surrender, but then something went wrong, and according to the Russians, the Ukrainian commander who was responsible for the negotiation process from the Ukrainian side was killed by other Ukrainian soldiers from other groups, from other brigades that were located on the territory of this complex. Anyway, the negotiation process talks failed, and then the Russians make a very difficult decision. They decided to begin assault operation on the territory of this church complex, which is very important from cultural perspective for the Russians. In this video that we got yesterday, we can see how the Russians began bombing and attacking the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine on this elevation with the Krasnopol shell. And as for the 15th of April, today we got another video, and as for this video we can see that the Russians began bombing and attacking the territory of this church, of this complex, with a significant number of multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and with Iskander missiles. You know that this is not just a church, not just something like just this regular building. This is a complex with the significant number of facilities below the surface, and the Russians understand that Ukrainians most likely managed to concentrate a lot of soldiers, let's say, in these facilities, in the basements of this complex, with a lot of weapons, food and water, and the Russians realized that the only way how they can take under control this elevation is to reduce this territory to ruins, and obviously that was a very difficult decision for the Russians. But despite this decision, the Russians began attacking this territory. Most likely there are going to be very heavy clashes on the territory of this church. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Belgorod direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack the territory of the villages of Avdiivka and Popovka with a significant number of vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, personnel, soldiers, and so on. And in this video we can see how the Russians were repelling another Ukrainian attack with the use of FPV drones. As you can see, the Russians, probably for the first time since the battle for the Belgorod direction, managed to stop or managed to slow down the Ukrainians on the territory of Ukraine. So during the previous attempts, the Ukrainians, let's say, could enter the territory of the Russian Federation, and only then the Russians were attacking Ukrainian vehicles. As for the current situation, as you can see, the Ukraine offensive operation was stopped in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Prokhody, which means that the Russians managed to stabilize the situation. The Russians managed to improve their reconnaissance and intelligence position formations. The Russians managed to concentrate lots of drones above this area that provide information 24 hours per 7 days, and the Russians now see everything. And if Ukrainians start another offensive, the Russians try to stop this offensive operation on the territory of Ukraine, but not on the territory of the Russian Federation. Currently, the Russian sources reported that they managed to discover another concentration of forces of the armored forces of Ukraine to the north of the settlement by the name of Popovka. In this video, we can see how the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover another concentration of forces of the armored forces of Ukraine, and then the Russians began bombing and attacking this territory. As for now, it's very difficult to understand whether the Ukrainians were planning to concentrate their forces in this forest with the purpose to move further on the territory of the Russian Federation from another direction, or the Ukrainians concentrated their forces on the territory of this forest because the Ukrainians found out that the Russians were about to begin offensive operation in the direction of the settlement by the name of Miropolye, and the Ukrainian concentration on the border had just one purpose: to slow down the Russians and not to allow the Russians to advance in the direction of this settlement. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupyansk direction. As for the northern Kupyansk direction, we haven't received lots of updates. As you can see, the Russians for some reason stopped their offensive operation. Either the Russians are regrouping right now, or the Ukrainians managed to bring additional forces, reinforcements and reserves in the direction of the northern Kupyansk, and they managed to stabilize the situation. Now the Russians understand that this is not a very good time to continue offensive. Now it's time for the Russians to begin offensive somewhere else, and this situation will force the Ukrainians to take reserves from this area and to send them, let's say, to the Chasiv Yar direction, or let's say to the Pokrovsk direction, or something like this, and then the Russians will be able to resume their offensive. As for now, just missile strikes, FAB strikes, FPV drone duels, and so on, and nothing more. No changes on the ground. But I'll remind you that during the previous weeks we got lots of updates that the Russians almost took under control the settlement of Kindrashevka. We got reports that the Russians almost reached the settlement of Gasinka, but as you can see, nothing of those reports were confirmed during the previous several days. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupyansk direction, or the Lyman direction, where according to information we have, the flower of Lyman is blooming right now. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their position significantly. Basically, the village of Nova is currently semi-encircled by the Russians. The most important is that the Russians managed to cut the main supply lines that go to the village from the south and from the northwest. This is the situation on the ground. The Russians are about to begin offensive operation on the territory of settlement. As for now, the Russians are trying to concentrate their forces along the village from the southeastern part toward the northeastern part, and most likely during the next 48 hours the Russians will begin their offensive, or at least they will start checking and testing the Ukrainian defense around the settlement itself. Now let's talk about another direction. After the Russians managed to advance and to achieve such good results when talking about offensive operation in the vicinity of these settlements, the Russians launched another offensive operation from the line between the settlements of Novodiana, Makeyevka in the western direction. According to information we have, the Russians are attacking from these two settlements with the purpose to take the village of Grepovka under complete control. We have pro-Russian update. For example, pro-Russian resources reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to take under control these three lines and fields. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their FPV drone activities to the southwest of the settlement of Novovodiana. In this video, we can see how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking the units and the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, trying to clear this territory before the beginning of offensive operation. So we expect some activization of the Russian units in this direction, where they will try to cut this salient. They will try to establish control over the territories to the east of this red line. Now let's move further. As for the Limtarskoye, we haven't received anything. We got just one video, how the Russians attacked the city of Zarechny. As we can see, the Russians also stopped on the territory of this settlement. I'll remind you that according to different sources, according to Russian sources, for example, they managed to take under control up to 60% of the village, but still without any proofs. The Ukrainians reported that there are no Russians in the village and that they have strong control over this territory. Now let's discuss the situation in the Siversk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the village by the name of Grigorivka. During the previous 24 hours, more precisely during the previous 48 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. We see a certain dynamic in this area. The Russians are advancing in the northwestern direction, and we believe that currently the Russians are trying to take under control everything that is located to the east of these red lines. So we are talking about the territory between the Seversky Donetsk River and, let's say, the settlement of Zlatarevka. The Russians are trying to shorten the distance to the village by the name of Serebryanka and then to begin offensive, or at least to begin the siege of this settlement. During the previous 24 hours, 48 hours, the Russians improved their positions. We have geolocation that confirmed this. In this video that was published yesterday, we can see the counter-attack of the armored forces of Ukraine in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Grigorovka, and based on this video we have adjusted the map, and today we got another confirmation that the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the settlement of Belgorodka. We will not open this icon, this video, because there are lots of casualties and lots of violence. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Chasiv Yar direction. As for this territory, we see that another day, no record, no movements, no progress on the ground was recorded. And you know that the city of Chasiv Yar and the battle for the city of Chasiv Yar is becoming the longest battle since the beginning of the special military operation. Currently, there are two cities. We can say that there are longest battles probably since the beginning of the special military operation. The record belongs, of course, to the city of Bakhmut. Since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians spent around 8 months to take under complete control the territory of this stronghold. And according to information we have, during the next several days, months, weeks, it will be a year since the beginning of the battle for the city of Chasiv Yar. So, for example, the battle for the city of Selidovo took much less time. The battle for the city for every single city took around 4, 5, 6, 7 months. It depends on direction, it depends on the situation. But the city of Chasiv Yar is the longest battle, and we see that there are still a lot of job to do. As for now, the Russians control around 60% of the village, and there are still a lot of things to do in the Shevchenko micro district, in the Yuzhny micro district, and in the Cech number 2 micro district. So as you can see, the Ukrainians have very strong control over these territories. No matter and despite the resources the Russians are using to, let's say, to break through the Ukrainian defense belt, there are still a lot of job to do. The Ukrainians understand if they lose the battle of Chasiv Yar, most likely they will lose the battle for Konstantinovka automatically, and then this is going to be not just a matter of whether the Russians are able to do this or not. It's going to be just a matter of time when the Russians will be able to take the city of Konstantinovka and the complete control. Now let's discuss about the situation. Let's talk about the situation around the city of Toretsk, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And today, for the first time since the Russian breakthrough in the direction of the settlement by the name of Nilipovka, we got the first geolocation that give us more or less interesting, let's say, update or information. In this video, we can see the episode, one of the episodes of Russian breakthrough that took place several days ago. In this video, we can see Ukrainian drone that was flying along the road in the vicinity of Nilipovka, searching for the Russian soldiers, Russian vehicles and equipment that managed to break through the Ukrainian defense. And in this very moment, we see that the Ukrainian FPV drone operator managed to discover a Russian soldier. This is a Russian soldier that was attacked by the Ukrainian drone exactly in this point. This video confirms that indeed the Russians managed to break through. Of course, the Russians lost vehicles, the Russians lost everything they had in this offensive operation, but the Russians didn't lose infantry. Infantry managed to land in this area to take under complete control and to establish strong positions. So currently this is the situation. As for now, we are not going to adjust, of course, anything, because once again the video that you've just seen took place during the first day of Russian offensive in this area. Nothing new, nothing special has been published since that date. Anyway, at the same time, while the Ukrainians are trying to unblock and to stabilize the situation between this village of Nilipovka and the city of Toretsk, the Russians continue their offensive operation along the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal towards the settlement by the name of Avdiivka. During the previous 24 hours, we got several videos how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions and how the Russians managed to capture up to 5 Ukrainian soldiers that were surrendered along the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal. So we see that the Russians are trying to use some situation in their favor. Now let's talk about the southern Konstantinovka direction or the Kliban-Bytska direction, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions once again. According to information we have, the Russians secured the village of Valentinovka completely. This information was published by pro-Russian resources somewhere at 4 p.m. and the Russians continue their offensive, and according to information we have, the first Russian troopers managed to enter the settlement of Sukhaya Balka from the southwest. As you can see, to the east of the village of Sukhaya Balka, there is a huge, very complex, dense network of the fortifications, and as you can see, the Russians decided not to attack these fortifications in front, these strongholds from the east to the west. The Russians managed to outflank these strongholds from the south and from the southwest, and we see that Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian defense collapsed completely. We believe that tomorrow we're going to receive additional changes on the ground, and we believe that during the next 10-20 days we will color this territory either in the contested area favor or in the Russian favor, because we see that despite Ukrainian attempts, despite things that Ukrainians are trying to, let's say, do in this direction, they still haven't managed to stabilize this area. Now let's talk about the eastern Pokrovsk flank, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and we see that the Russians are trying to attack the settlement of Malinovka. The Russians are bombing and attacking this village for the second day in a row. Today we got another video how the Russians bombed the settlement with FAB. Yesterday we got almost the same video. The Russians were bombing Malinovka, but in the eastern part of the settlement. So now we see that the Russians are trying to reduce this village to ruins and to destroy the Ukrainian temporary deployment points and fire positions. At the same time, the Ukrainians, with the purpose to stabilize the situation during the previous 24 hours, carry out counter-attack with the purpose to restore control over the lost territories, but the Russians managed to discover Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, and the Russians sent a group of FPV drone operators that destroyed the vehicles that were involved in that offensive operation. Ukrainians suffered huge losses and were forced to fall back, which means that the Russians stabilized the situation, and now the Russians are preparing themselves before the beginning of another wave of attack. And as for the next target for the Russians, they will try to take under control this company's stronghold between the settlement of Yelizavetovka and the settlement of Malinovka. Now let's talk about the southern flank of the city of Pokrovsk, and telling the truth, starting from the beginning of April, we are receiving more and more videos from this area. And for example, I would like to point your attention to this unique scene from the southern part of the city of Pokrovsk. In this video we can see how the Russians, with the use of two flamethrower systems and multiple launch rocket systems, were reducing the southern part of the city till ruins. Just imagine yourself, the Russian drone was flying through the epicenter of Russian artillery fire with a significant number of missiles, bombs, and so on. Crazy video, obviously. I'm telling the truth, this video tells us that this is something like artillery preparation. Furthermore, during the previous days, or since the beginning of April, the Russians were over-focused in this area. The Russians were using every single caliber they have with the purpose to attack Ukrainian positions. Lots of FABs were used by the Russians. The Russians were using two flamethrower systems with the purpose to destroy the Ukrainian positions along the railways, not just, let's say, during the months, but also today we got another video. So the concentration of this heavy artillery fire on the Ukrainian positions between the Russian positions and the city of Pokrovsk tell us that most likely the Russians have some plans for this area, and we believe that something huge is going to happen here in the very near future. The Russians most likely will try to attack in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk and to improve their positions by taking under control everything to the south of this red line. If the Russians are able to do this and to take the southern part of the city of Pokrovsk and to dig in deeper, this can be the beginning of complete collapse of Ukrainian Ukrainian defense in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Of course, in the combination with the Russian offensive on the eastern flank in the vicinity of Malinovka, and of course in the combination of Russian offensive on the western flank. So something big is coming from this area, obviously. As for the South Donetsk direction, we have several updates. The Russians continue their offensive towards the settlement of Odradny and Bogatyr. This information was also confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources, as you can see. But from the other side, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that, for example, today or these days, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over the settlement by the name of Dniproenergia. The commander of the tactical group Vuglidar, Sergei Nayev, reported that the defense forces managed to restore control over the village of Dniproenergia in the Novosilovsky direction about 2 weeks ago. I'll remind you that several weeks ago, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported about complete control, but now the Ukrainians are saying that they managed to restore control over this territory. Anyway, let's wait for, let's say, deep state update or for some other pro-Ukrainian update or some geolocation, and then we will adjust the map. But obviously we will keep this information in our minds. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the Shevchenko direction. And during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of videos where we can see that the Russians carry out probably one of the biggest offensive operations in this area with the use of a significant number of vehicles. For example, just in this episode, in this scene, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 vehicles that were involved by the Russians in this offensive operation, and the significant number of infantry. And as a result of this offensive operation, of course, several vehicles and tanks were destroyed by the Ukrainians, but we got one geolocation from the territory of the northwestern part of the settlement of Shevchenko. There is a video, there is an episode where we can see Russian vehicles damaged in this part of the city, of the village. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. We know for sure that the Russians entered Shevchenko. We don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to dig in deeper, but we colored the map, and we were not sure that the Russians will be able to hold their positions during the upcoming night. So of course, Ukrainians during the upcoming night will try to counterattack with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back, and everything, then we will understand what is going to be next. So as for now, we have something like this, but obviously during this upcoming night is going to be very difficult for this village and for both armies. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.